Francisco d'Ancona.
Watching, we know you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode of Face to Face with me, Syed Ali. Syria, 5 years on, and more than 200,000 people killed, and half the population in need of humanitarian aid. Is there an end in sight? And with me to discuss this is Ahmed Hamouda, the Middle East editor of Islam21C. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
How complex is the Syrian conflict?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The Syrian conflict has become, on the outset, incredibly complex. It never started that way. It started with some peaceful protests and through some children writing some calligraphy on walls asking for the removal of the Assad regime, maybe more light-hearted than anything. And then this developed into protests once the government began its crackdown on these children. And then later these protests led to bloodshed. Government Assad forces started to shoot the protesters, and eventually an armed struggle ensued. And now we have the situation we are in today. It is complex if you want it to be complex, and simple if you want it to be simple, and maybe we can discuss this further.
But 5 years on, since those demonstrations that you're talking about, who's involved in the complex, at least internally for now?
There are hundreds of different factions involved. Some factions, we believe, are closer to achieving the objectives of the conflict or the objectives of the revolution than others. And by objective, I mean the removal of the Assad regime and the development of an all-encompassing, tolerant society in Syria that is peaceful and developing for the Muslims and for other faiths in the region. And other factions have external.
We can talk about these factions more, but you said they have an objective to get rid of Assad.
Mm-hmm.
Are they winning this war, these factions?
To a large extent, they were making a lot of progresses and gains. But when international players began to become involved, things began to hinder slowly until now we have a situation of a stalemate. One side being supported heavily, the Assad regime being supported heavily by Eastern forces from and militias and gangs and factions and Russia and other military, and the other side being supported by other external influences. But really here our concentration is on the Syrian people, the plight they are facing, the humanitarian crisis, and their demands to remove this dictatorship, this bloodthirsty regime that has killed almost 250,000 people.
But we know that the Syrians were living under a peaceful situation. Has this revolution failed?
It is not the revolution that has failed. It is the international community that has failed to support their demands for a democratic system in Syria that achieves the aims of other democratic countries across the world. If they were sincere, if the world was sincere.
But 5 years on, and they're nowhere near their objective of getting rid of Assad, as you've said. This brutal individual, in your own words, in your articles, then surely they have failed.
When people demand democracy, they should be supported by the international community. Other countries fell by countries waging war on them in the name of democracy, like Iraq and Afghanistan. When it came to the Syrians requesting the removal of the Assad regime, Bashar al-Assad in power for now almost 15 years, and before him his father Hafez al-Assad, who waged a bloody campaign in Hama, killing 40,000 people. They are legitimate in their cries and in their requests, so it becomes incumbent upon the international community to support them. What has led to this blood?
But do they want, you say the international community should support them in their quest for democracy. Do they really want democracy? We have factions like the Islamic State. They don't want a democracy.
We have expressed our opinions concerning the Islamic State, our severe condemnation of their ideology and of their movement. What we question when it comes to the international intervention against the so-called Islamic State is why this international coalition, at their forefront America and Russia, are attacking these same factions that are fighting the Islamic State and hindering them from progression. Why is this? Very recently, Russia have showered the suburbs of Damascus with missiles and bombs, and it is well known that in the suburbs of Damascus, the factions that control these areas are nothing to do with ISIS or this evil faction. So so there are many questions that can be asked about the international coalition, what their real aims are.
But there are many questions that could be raised amongst the factions themselves. They're disunited. We don't know where their allegiances lie. We don't know what they represent, what their values are, what they want at the end of this conflict.
That's true.
Can they be trusted?
Actually, when we look at Syria, we need to draw broad lines, things that are established as definite within Syria. So what we know for definite is that there is a group in Syria. We don't necessarily know who it is. We think it is not ISIS, and we definitely know it is not the regime that is upon the truth. And this is by the dictates of the hadith. There will always be a faction, the hadith of Abu Umama al-Bahili. And this لا تزال implicates what they call daimuma, which is persistency, something that is always the case. Mm-hmm. When they ask the Prophet, where are this group of people who are fighting upon the truth and who are defending the truth fervently?
Who are they? I mean, can you name any of these factions?
It is difficult to name the factions, but when we look at this with Syria, we need to look at it objectively, not through the lens of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So, for instance, the preservation of life, which of the factions preserves the most life? Which of the factions is trying to defeat oppression, objective oppression? Which of the factions is tolerant of the society, tolerant of all communities? Which of the factions wants to preserve wealth and life and health and wants to achieve the broader aims of the revolution? And then with these...
Well, some people are saying that some of these factions are oppressing minorities like Christians, Alawite, the Druze minorities. So these factions themselves are oppressive, would you not say?
Possibly this is the case, even though the story coming out from Syria is obscured by the take of the respective narratives in the West. We have the right-wing extreme narrative, we have the left-wing narrative, which is in many extent, to a large extent, pro-Assad. Not all of it, some of it is severely confused. But really, when we look at the situation, we need to see that there is a faction in Syria that represents the closest as what to the foremost objectives of the revolution. This is what we should concentrate on.
Okay, so the factions that you're saying who are representing, who are more legitimate than, let's say, ISIS, what do they stand for? What are their objectives? So
you mentioned being tolerant of other communities. Really, the exemplary for this is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We as Muslims across the world would love the establishment of a real, genuine Islamic state as per the image of the Islamic state that existed in the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Within the community of Medina existed 3 different tribes who were Jews. Within the Arabian Peninsula existed polytheists, people.
So you're advocating for an Islamic state? Isn't that what the so-called Islamic State or ISIS are pursuing? What's the difference?
There's a world of a difference. There is the so-called Islamic State, and there is the real Islamic State. That's why we call it the so-called Islamic State. And there was the real Islamic State upon the foundations and fundamentals established by Allah Azza wa Jal and by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as per the understanding of the mainstream Muslims and as per the dictates of the 4 schools of thought that are followed by all of the Muslims across the world. And this is a state that has objectives. These objectives must be fulfilled in order for this state to be considered a correct
I'm a little bit worried in the sense that while you call for the help of Westerners or Western forces, yet you call for an Islamic state. Could you not understand why they're suspicious?
We don't call for the help of any external forces. Maybe only legitimate Islamic forces to help resolve the situation. As Allah Azza wa Jalla says in the Quran, if 2 factions fight one another and one infringes the rights of another, or to the closest of this meaning, then fight the one who is infringing upon the other until they return to the rule of Allah Azza wa Jal. But in general, we reject all forms of intervention. We believe that the Syrian people themselves are capable of changing their regime, creating a more democratic system.
But is this a Syrian conflict in the sense that we have Iran involved, we have Russia involved, we have the US and their allies involved, Turkey, Qatar, to name a few. Is this really a Syrian conflict? Is this conflict in the hands of the Syrian people?
The involvement of international forces is very unfortunate and is rejected. At their foremost, the involvement of the 50 different Western nations, and most recently the involvement of Russia. This has only been to the detriment of the revolution, and it has bolstered both ISIS and both the regime. When we see that the factions that are being attacked and bombarded are those moderate factions that are fighting ISIS and that are fighting the regime and trying to create this pluralistic democratic society that is founded upon Islamic principles, much like, for instance, like the Turkish example, much like the example of Egypt under President Mohammed Morsi. So the intervention of these forces is something very sad and unfortunate, but it's something that we have to deal with now. Really, our aim as external onlookers should be to support the just demands of the people of Syria, to support the humanitarian crisis, to support the refugees as much as possible, to minimize the harm this conflict has caused.
We will look into the humanitarian situation of the Syrians. On the humanitarian subject, more than 200,000 people have died, innocent lives. Half the population is in need of humanitarian assistance. Isn't this conflict taking a huge toll on the civilians?
Of course, this is something without question. This is when the civilians of the world need to step up to the plate and support the refugees, support the Syrians in whatever way possible. But we believe that the end solution to this conflict is the removal of the main problem, which is the Assad regime that has in one single attack.
But you've had 5 years to get rid of him. The factions had 5 years. I mean, and still, he's still in power. If not, he's stronger than he ever was.
That's true. And actually, this is very unfortunate. The fact that he's still in power is a failure from the international community, but that does not defeat the purpose of the revolution in removing him. Why? Because if we are to say, okay, all of the factions now should stop in their pursuing the removal of the Assad regime, all of the people should stop in their demands of a democratic country in Syria. Then
but 5 years on, and people are dying, countless numbers of people are dying. Just 2 million alone in Turkey. Another million Syrian refugees have fled to Europe. Another million in Lebanon. Really, how long can this go on?
We pray for an end to this conflict as soon as possible. But we think people need to be more objective in identifying how this conflict will end. It is inconceivable for it to end with the Assad regime still present in government, because it will pursue revenge against all of the revolutionaries, all of the protesters.
So you can't see a future Syria with Assad.
It is absolutely inconceivable and impossible. Just like we could not see a future in the Western Europe with Hitler. He was removed, and there was
surely
a huge...
you can't compare Hitler to Assad.
I think all phases of comparison are very valid. Assad has used chemical weapons in Douma, in single attacks. He has used sarin. He has used chlorine. He has his factions have used white weaponry, knives, and they have slaughtered people and children and women. Really, Assad, if anything, he is one of the worst dictators that recent history has seen, under the impunity of the West and the East.
But what is the solution? That the war goes on for another 5 years and another 200,000 people and more Syrians leaving the country?
If there was a real international sentiment to remove the Assad regime, he would have been removed. But I do believe that international players have an interest in maintaining the status quo in Syria just as it is, for influences of, or possibly for effects to neighbors like Israel, possibly to because they are scared of the future in Syria, what it may bring.
But how could you not be scared of if there are groups like ISIS or Islamic States who are committing atrocity beyond the Syrian border?
Like we have mentioned, the first group to condemn ISIS were the Muslims, and those who have suffered the most in the conflict against ISIS are the Muslim factions in Syria. And the ideological condemnation of ISIS came out even before the world knew who ISIS were. The fatwa, the rulings from the scholars from Syrian scholars, we related some from the Syrian Scholars Association of Scholars and other international reputable scholars condemning them. The question is, these factions, why are they not bolstered? Why are they being attacked and targeted? The factions that could have defeated ISIS.
Well, these factions have been bolstered by the West and by some are alleging whether it's Turkey or Qatar or the Saudis. They're getting their funding and their weaponry from somewhere, aren't they? For example, groups who are not ISIS, some of the other factions, they've received funding from Turkey, from Qatar, from the US, so the ones who are more lenient, for example. But some of their weaponry has ended up in the hands of ISIS.
This is I don't believe there is a real sense of urgency among the international community to defeat ISIS. And we asked the question as well. ISIS are causative of the Assad regime. ISIS, this extreme ideology, was created on the back of the international dismissal of what was happening in Syria. Because the Assad regime was allowed to be maintained and flourished, and it was bolstered by Iran and by Hezbollah and by other factions, then a counter-extreme ideology emerged that totally sees everybody as a target and sees all of Syria as available and open for them. So if we want to counter a counter, then we need to look at the original problem, remove the original issue, just like Hitler was the original problem, fascism in Europe. When he was removed, fascism in Europe ended, and we ended up with a democratic Europe that everybody enjoys. This is what the Syrian people are demanding. It is very difficult to understand why the international community is not comprehending.
Yeah, but what we have is, these are the facts on the ground. We have a war that isn't going anywhere 5 years on. Okay, we have a very extreme terrorist organization, ISIS. We have Assad. Where do you see? Is there an end in sight? Where's the end?
I think it is I think the solution is multifaceted. It is something of bolstering the ideology that opposes ISIS to solve the ISIS problem. The ideology that opposes ISIS fundamentally is the Islamic ideology that the Prophet ﷺ has espoused. We have been told about a group who take Islam to extremes, the same way ISIS do. And we have been told about the solution to these groups. What we find is that those groups who follow the very orthodox, the very fundamental message of Islam are also being targeted. So any hope for the removal of ISIS is being squandered by the West. And at the same time, there is no effort against the Assad regime. We ask why the vote in the British Parliament went forth for the attacking of ISIS, but it did not go forth for the attacking of the Assad regime. And then we ask furthermore why British warplanes and American warplanes are attacking those factions who are nothing to do with ISIS whatsoever.
Well, we don't know that. I'm not sure what your evidence is to suggest that British soldiers or the British army are bombing non-ISIS targets.
The very leader of one of the factions or multiple factions called the Islamic Front, he came out in 2 Al Jazeera interviews and he affirmed that the sky is being shared by Syrian airplanes and by American and Western aircraft, and both of them are attacking the Islamic Front, who is in the face of ISIS.
Okay.
Why is this the case?
So in your opinion, there is no future with Assad in place?
Not at all. It is impossible.
Not even through a transition?
Maybe through a peaceful transition, but not with Assad present in Syria or the Assad regime. This needs to be completely removed. Syria needs to start from scratch. All of those who affected the destruction and who influenced the destruction of Syria need to help in rebuilding it.
Yeah, but what if you have the scenario where the war continues. If you're adamant and you're sticking to Assad must go, okay, you're asking for another 5 years of war.
We're speaking from a very objective, principled perspective. We are saying that the only way to achieve a solution is to remove the problem. If the problem is not removed, then a solution cannot be achieved. Whether Assad is the problem or not, this is another conversation, but I hope we've mentioned enough to affirm that he is the original problem.
Do you think this uprising was all worth it?
I think there is a sacrifice in every uprising. The Syrians believe that they're uprising because they saw precedents in North Africa. They believe their uprising wouldn't be at this severe cost, but now they are in a stalemate. They are in a situation where if they continue, there will be more bloodshed, and if they stop, they will return to square one with the Assad regime, possibly seeking to avenge all of the people who took part in the rebellion. So really, the only solution for the Syrians should come from genuine international players coming on the table, negotiating a removal of the Assad regime,
So the
or
rebellion,
actively
so
removing
the rebellion
Assad
has
regime.
failed, in your opinion, as it stands.
The rebellion is in no position to succeed or to fail. It is continuing at the moment. It may fail if the Assad regime continues to be bolstered by Western and Eastern movements and governments. It may fail indeed, or it may succeed if they change their stance towards the Assad regime and remove this problem once and for all.
What is the role of the international community in this conflict?
It is a number of things. The international community should support the legitimate demands of the Syrian people in ensuring that there's a democratic Syria as soon as possible. The international community, if it is worried about ISIS, should support logistically those factions who are against ISIS. If it is, and the international community should realize that ISIS are causative of the Assad regime, and the Assad regime needs to be removed. We have precedents where other regimes were removed. Syria needs to be looked at like Bosnia, not like Iraq and Afghanistan.
Here's what I find contradicting. On one hand, you're saying you don't need the international community, and now you're saying you need the international community's involvement to bring about a peaceful solution to this conflict. Okay, where I mean, this is very confusing for many people.
It should not be
Do
confusing.
you need the international, or you don't need the international community?
No.
You can go on with this conflict all by yourselves for however long it will take you. To another 200,000 people killed, more refugees, more exodus of the country, just on the point of Assad going away.
We reject the intervention of the international community as it stands currently. Currently, all players in the Syrian conflict have a vested interest. But we request the intervention of the international community on an impartial basis. If a country from the external intervenes in Syria, seeking to fulfill the aspirations of the Syrian people, then we are very happy with this intervention. If, as it currently stands, every player is trying to pull in their own direction, trying to fulfill their own take on the conflict, trying to fulfill their own ambitions. We have Syria trying to defend its port in Tartus. We have America trying to keep its influence in the Middle East. We reject this intervention totally. What we request is intervention that brings about the aspirations of the Syrian people, stemming from genuine countries who want to achieve this.
Okay, we keep referring to the international community, and every time we refer to the international community, we're referring to mainly the West. Okay, where are the Muslims, the Muslim countries in this conflict? What is their input?
The Muslim countries in general, they are not fulfilling their entire duty. But this is not surprising because they themselves have come out of an era of colonization. Some of them are under occupation, others are subjugated by their regimes, and so on and so forth. But there are Muslim countries like Turkey, for instance, taking on millions of Syrian refugees, providing whatever logistical support it can to Syrians, trying to fulfill the aspirations of the Syrian people. There are other governments offering huge humanitarian help. So there are forces of good and there are many forces of evil. We have also countries like Jordan, despite its limited resource and capability, taking on thousands of refugees. This needs to be appreciated, but on an individual basis, every single person in the world needs to fulfill their duty towards the people of Syria. I just want to conclude with this point. The people of Syria, do not want to be outside of Syria. They want to be inside Syria. So when they come knocking on your door, realize that one day you may be knocking on their door. So accommodate them, and hopefully Allah Azza wa Jal will keep our lives, inshallah, peaceful and secure.
Okay, Jazakallah khairan, Ahmad Hamouda. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but thank you for joining us on this show, on this episode of Face to Face. We really appreciate your input into this subject.
Exactly.
And to you, dear viewers, thank you very much for joining us once again on this episode of Face to Face. You can find out more about the subject matter on our website. But until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.